When Ivanka Trump's cutting words to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sliced through the elegant ballroom silence, nobody anticipated the surgical precision of the response that would follow. The remark wasn't whispered or mumbled. It rang clear and unmistakable, landing like a hammer blow against crystal. "I think you should go back to Africa." The sentence escaped Ivanka's lips as if it had been rehearsed, cutting through the gentle symphony of silverware and sophisticated chatter. Instantly, the Mayflower Hotel ballroom froze. Conversations died mid-syllable. Heads turned in unison, and for several heartbeats, the entire room held its collective breath. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless mere feet away. Her hands remained steady, her expression unchanged. Even the crystal glass of sparkling water in her grip never wavered. She simply fixed her gaze on Ivanka. Not with fury, not with shock, but with the focused intensity of someone preparing to deliver a masterclass. The tension was suffocating. Every guest felt it. The weight of witnessing something that would ripple far beyond these gilded walls. Phones subtly shifted toward the confrontation as whispered conversations evaporated into expectant silence. Then, with deliberate calm, Jasmine drew a measured breath. The kind that signals you're about to hear something that will reshape the entire moment. "I was born in Dallas, Texas," she began, her voice steady as bedrock. "My family has been here for generations. We've bled in wars for this nation, built enterprises, educated countless children, and paid the very taxes that fund gatherings like this." A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd, barely audible, yet unmistakable. Crockett continued with unwavering composure. "So when you suggest I should go back to Africa, what you're actually declaring is that my citizenship is conditional. That my belonging here requires your approval. Let me be crystal clear. This country belongs to me just as much as it belongs to you. Perhaps even more." Camera phones emerged like fireflies, red recording dots blinking from behind wine glasses and centerpieces. Every word was being captured, every gesture preserved for posterity. Ivanka maintained her composure, sipping champagne with practiced elegance, but her eyes betrayed her, darting toward the political donors whose unreadable expressions spoke volumes. Crockett's voice never rose, yet each word cut deeper than the last. "The profound irony, Miss Trump, is that your family's American narrative spans merely a few generations. Mine reaches back centuries, long before your grandfather first glimpsed Ellis Island. Unlike him, my ancestors didn't arrive seeking fortune. They were dragged here in chains." The sentence hung in the air like a funeral bell's toll. Someone cleared their throat nervously. A guest in formal attire shifted uncomfortably, his tuxedo suddenly feeling constrictive. But Crockett wasn't finished dismantling the moment. "You attempted to diminish me with that comment, but instead, you've perfectly illustrated the coded racism poisoning our politics. You've demonstrated how certain individuals still believe they hold the authority to determine who qualifies as American enough. Tonight, you've given that prejudice a face." Her tone remained surgical, precise, controlled, victorious. She wasn't arguing. She was delivering a closing statement to a case already won. The applause began tentatively, a single pair of hands from the room's center, then another, building into a crescendo that filled every corner of the ballroom. Ivanka managed a tight smile, offered a curt nod, and took another calculated sip of champagne. But she offered no rebuttal, no defense. Jasmine didn't need one. She turned gracefully, acknowledged the support surrounding her, and stepped back from center stage. This wasn't retreat. It was a strategic exit, knowing the real performance was just beginning. Because those phones had been recording, and within hours, the world would witness exactly what transpired within these exclusive walls. The conversation was about to explode far beyond this awkward exchange at a fundraising dinner. But before the headlines and viral clips, there was the room itself, the power brokers, the influence peddlers, the stakes they were gambling with that evening. And that backdrop matters just as much as the confrontation. The Mayflower Hotel ballroom that night epitomized power disguised as sophistication. Crystal chandeliers bathed round tables in warm light, each draped in pristine ivory linens. Every place setting gleamed, polished silverware, crystal stemware, name cards scripted in flowing gold. This was where authentic conversations occurred beyond microphone reach, where deals weren't signed but sealed with knowing glances and firm handshakes. This wasn't merely another Washington fundraiser. The annual Liberty Foundation dinner drew an exclusive guest list. Not just donors, but the midnight phone call crowd who could reshape legislation with whispered words. Tonight's gathering mixed senators with tech titans, retired generals with media moguls, all sharing intimate conversations that could shift political landscapes. Jasmine Crockett's presence was strategic, not accidental. Her congressional record on voting rights and economic reform had made her simultaneously a rising star and a lightning rod. Some guests admired her fearless advocacy. Others viewed her as a direct threat to their comfortable status quo. But regardless of opinion, everyone paid attention when she spoke. Ivanka Trump's attendance carried its own calculated message. Though she'd stepped back from formal politics after her father's presidency, everyone understood her influence remained potent. The organization she represented tonight might not officially connect to any campaign, but the signal was unmistakable. She remained a formidable player in the political arena. Even the seating arrangements told a story. Crockett's table positioned her with perfect sight lines to nearly every corner of the ballroom. Ivanka's table sat just 3 away, surrounded by the evening's most substantial corporate donors. Their inevitable collision wasn't coincidence. It was political theater waiting for its cue. Conversations drifted from inflation concerns to midterm projections, hushed speculation about Supreme Court decisions, and whispered theories about Pennsylvania's next Senate race. But beneath every exchange lay shared awareness. Every interaction carried weight here. A compliment, a handshake, even an offhand comment could birth tomorrow's headlines if the wrong ears overheard. That context made Ivanka's remarks so shocking. Not merely the words themselves, but their delivery in one of Washington's most meticulously managed environments. These were people trained in narrative control, masters of diplomatic language and strategic silence. Yet here was raw, unfiltered prejudice delivered in a setting designed to prevent exactly these moments. Across the room, political consultant Brian Alford leaned toward his colleague, whispering, "Did she actually just say that?" His colleague, eyes fixed on Crockett, gave an almost imperceptible nod. At the bar's far end, veteran journalist Grace Whitmore had been nursing bourbon while mentally cataloging interview targets. But after hearing Ivanka's words, her evening's priorities shifted dramatically. She quietly retrieved her phone, typed a rapid message to her editor, and added a single line. "You're going to want to see this." Even the waitstaff sensed the atmospheric shift. A server carrying dessert plates unconsciously slowed her pace, glancing toward the room's center before continuing her duties. Years in hospitality had taught her to recognize significant moments, even without understanding their full implications. For Crockett, though, the stakes transcended mere optics. This was about fundamental principles. She'd built her career challenging those who believed power granted them permission to diminish others. The fact that this happened here, before people controlling millions in political donations, only amplified the moment's significance. But there was something else, something invisible to casual observers. Crockett understood that in politics, moments like this transcend their immediate context. They live on, repeated, reinterpreted, and replayed until they become permanent public record. How you handle them can define careers for decades. So while Ivanka's comments still echoed in the air, Crockett recognized that the phones in people's pockets had become her true audience. The donors and politicians at these tables were now secondary players. The real stage had shifted to millions who would later watch this unfold through slow-motion replays, captions, and hashtags. As murmurs faded and applause swelled, you could almost feel the story crystallizing in real time. Some guests avoided eye contact, knowing their presence here might soon face scrutiny. Others moved closer to Crockett, offering quiet support, eager to associate themselves with this moment. But if you watched carefully, you could see Ivanka's glance toward the side exit. Not panic, but calculation. She understood she'd just armed her critics with powerful ammunition, and Crockett was exactly the type to load every available round. To understand why this remark cuts so deep, you need to know the history between these women and how their paths had been circling each other long before tonight. This wasn't their first collision, though until now, it had always occurred from a distance. Crockett had claimed the national spotlight years earlier as Capitol Hill's relentless voice against voter suppression, systematically challenging federal policy inequities. Her style was razor-sharp yet deliberate. She framed arguments so they stuck, often in ways opponents couldn't easily counter. This precision made her a sought-after political talk show guest and a rising name in activist circles. Meanwhile, Ivanka had spent her post-White House years positioning herself as a polished, apolitical brand ambassador. She appeared at carefully selected conferences, engaged in strategic philanthropic efforts, and avoided political commentary's sharper edges. But Crockett's pointed criticisms of the Trump administration had struck uncomfortably close to home. Their first public intersection occurred during a televised economic development roundtable 2 years prior. Crockett spoke about job creation in underserved communities. Ivanka, appearing via video link, promoted her workforce initiatives from her father's presidency. The exchange remained civil, but Crockett's closing observation: workforce programs mean nothing if their creators don't understand the communities they're supposedly serving, went viral instantly. It wasn't a direct attack on Ivanka, but the internet treated it as such. Within hours, clips circulated with headlines like "Crockett's subtle swipe at Ivanka Trump lights up social media." Ivanka never responded publicly, but insiders reported her displeasure. Over the following year, Crockett's speeches occasionally referenced political dynasties profiting off working people's backs. She never named Ivanka specifically, but in Washington, where reading between lines is an Olympic sport, everyone understood the target. Ivanka's irritation reportedly deepened after Crockett addressed a Philadelphia civil rights rally, speaking about wealth and privilege acting as democracy's gatekeepers. Cameras captured Crockett networking with senators, civil rights leaders, and prominent business executives who had previously aligned with the Trump family. For Ivanka, the message was unmistakable. Crockett wasn't just discussing policy. She was building alliances that could challenge her family's influence. Then came the op-ed 6 months before tonight's dinner. Crockett penned a Washington Post piece critiquing the selective patriotism of certain political figures. She wrote, "It's easy to love America when it serves your interests. It's harder, and far more meaningful, to love it enough to fight for those it leaves behind." While the piece didn't mention Ivanka by name, it referenced programs and initiatives unmistakably linked to her White House tenure. Sources close to Ivanka said she viewed it as unnecessary provocation. To her, Crockett was using calculated language to erode the carefully curated image Ivanka had spent years crafting. Yet until tonight at the Mayflower, their tension had lived mostly in speeches, op-eds, and indirect jabs. There had never been a face-to-face confrontation without cameras and moderators present. Ironically, Crockett hadn't planned any interaction with Ivanka that evening. Her seat had been assigned long before the guest list was finalized, and she was there to speak briefly about election integrity initiatives in Arizona and Ohio. Ivanka's attendance wasn't even confirmed until 2 days before the event. But when dessert was served, Crockett stepped away from her table to greet a donor she'd been hoping to meet for months. She crossed the floor, exchanged pleasantries, and as she turned to leave, found herself face to face with Ivanka. What followed were polite smiles and measured tones. The kind of exchange where both women knew exactly who they were addressing, but pretended otherwise. "You've been busy," Ivanka said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to sound cordial, but not enough to hide the underlying edge. "Busy is productive," Crockett replied evenly, "especially when there's so much work to be done." From there, conversation shifted quickly to voting rights legislation, state-level reforms, and the growing rift between federal protections and local enforcement. Crockett made her points plainly, never raising her voice, never showing irritation, but her clarity left little room for evasion. Ivanka, according to witnesses, began looking less like a hostess making small talk and more like someone defending her record. Her responses grew shorter, her smile tighter. Then, as Crockett pressed the point about how certain federal rollbacks had disproportionately harmed minority voters, Ivanka delivered the line that would define both their legacies. It didn't emerge from nowhere. It came from years of simmering irritation, bruised pride, and the realization that this was one conversation she wasn't going to win. But to grasp why Crockett's response hit with such devastating force, you need to hear the moments leading directly to Ivanka's remark, and how quickly that polite exchange transformed into a political flashpoint. By the time Jasmine Crockett and Ivanka Trump stood face to face, the ballroom's ambient noise had become mere background static. Neither woman paid attention to anything beyond their increasingly focused exchange. The kind of moment where conversation narrows to a laser point, every word weighed for future implications. Voting rights legislation is something people love discussing theoretically, Ivanka began, tilting her head slightly. But realistic reforms must work for everyone, not just select groups. Crockett didn't flinch. They should work for everyone. But when certain changes allow rural communities to vote effortlessly while urban districts endure hours-long lines, that's not balance. That's selective access. Ivanka sipped her drink, seemingly buying time. Sometimes those differences stem from local management issues rather than federal policy. "How convenient," Crockett replied, her voice remaining calm. "Blame local management, and the policy architects never have to answer for the consequences." The exchange might have ended there, two women with opposing views parting politely, if not for how Crockett leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, but intentionally. "I've walked through polling stations in Detroit, Phoenix, and Dallas. I've witnessed the pattern firsthand. Fewer machines, longer waits, poll workers stretched impossibly thin. And the people most affected are consistently black and brown voters." Ivanka's smile tightened. "Jasmine, you make it sound like there's some grand conspiracy." "Not a conspiracy," Crockett said steadily. "Just identical results repeating endlessly when the people writing the rules aren't the ones standing in those lines." At a nearby table, two donors had abandoned their own conversation, clearly tuned into this exchange. One, a man in a perfectly tailored navy suit, shifted his chair for a better angle, his phone now resting openly on the table, screen illuminated. Ivanka's tone cooled noticeably. "You know there's a difference between fighting for your community and constantly positioning yourself as its only voice." "I've never claimed to be the only voice," Crockett responded evenly. "But I won't apologize for being one of the loud ones. Silence doesn't open polling stations earlier, doesn't ensure fair voter roll maintenance, and doesn't prevent certain politicians from deciding who gets to participate in democracy and who doesn't." The pause that followed was brief but electric. You could feel the conversation's temperature shift. This was no longer polite policy disagreement. It had become deeply personal. Ivanka's eyes flickered to a man in a dark blazer standing nearby, a longtime family associate, before returning to Crockett. "I think," she said slowly, deliberately, "that maybe if you're so unhappy with how this country operates, you might want to go back to Africa." The words dropped between them like lead weights. They didn't echo. They didn't need to. Every person within earshot heard them with crystalline clarity. For half a second, nobody moved. The donor with the phone didn't even try to hide, tapping the record button. A woman standing behind Crockett covered her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Crockett blinked once. "Say that again." Ivanka didn't repeat herself. She simply held Crockett's gaze, that small smile still in place. That's when Crockett's voice, low, measured, surgical, cut through the suffocating silence. "You think my citizenship is optional? That it's some kind of trial membership? My family has been in this country for over 2 centuries. We fought in wars long before your father entered the White House, long before your grandfather set foot on American soil. And unlike him, my ancestors didn't come here seeking opportunity. They were brought here in chains." Her tone never wavered, yet the underlying message was unmistakable. This wasn't just a response. It was a complete dismantling. At another table, a state representative from Ohio leaned over to whisper to her dinner partner. She just ended her. The conversation was over. Ivanka didn't attempt a rebuttal, didn't shift her stance, didn't even try to redirect. She simply turned slightly toward another guest, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a minor interruption. But it wasn't over. Not really. The cameras were rolling now. The story had been written in real time, and every person who'd heard it knew it would be reshaping conversations by morning. Yet Crockett's rebuttal wasn't just a single line. It was the opening to a larger statement that would transform a personal insult into a national moment. The weight of Ivanka's remark hadn't even fully settled before the room began reacting in subtle but telling ways. Conversations that had been flowing smoothly moments earlier hit abrupt walls. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the two women as though they'd stumbled into a scene they weren't sure they should be witnessing. Some reactions were nearly imperceptible, a raised eyebrow here, a clenched fist there, but others proved harder to conceal. One guest at the room's edge muttered something under his breath to his companion, only to receive a warning glance urging silence. A cluster of donors near the bar lowered their voices, but not before one said, "That's going to be a problem." Crockett stood perfectly still for several more seconds, her eyes never leaving Ivanka's face. But she wasn't staring her down. It was more like she was taking inventory, measuring the comment for what it truly represented and deciding how she wanted to respond. Then she spoke. "I want to ensure I heard you correctly," she said, clearly enough for surrounding tables to catch every syllable. "Because if I did, what you just said isn't merely wrong. It perfectly exemplifies what's broken about how too many privileged people think about belonging in this country." Ivanka maintained her straight posture, one hand loosely gripping her champagne glass stem. She didn't interrupt. "My family has been American for centuries," Crockett continued. "We didn't purchase our way into this country. We didn't arrive on luxury liners and launch businesses with inherited wealth. We were forced here, stripped of our names, our languages, our freedoms. And still, generation after generation, we've fought to make this place better, often for people who never wanted us here in the first place." The room was no longer pretending not to listen. Heads had turned. Forks rested silently on plates. "You say something like that to me, and it's not just a personal insult. It's a dismissal of every black soldier who fought under this flag. It's a dismissal of every black teacher who's educated America's children. It's a dismissal of every voter who stood in line for hours because their precinct had half the resources of the one across town." A faint murmur rolled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. "And here's the truth," Crockett added, her voice steady but now carrying a sharper edge. "Telling someone to go back doesn't come from patriotism. It comes from fear. Fear that the people you've overlooked, the people you've underestimated, are not only still here but thriving, succeeding, and refusing to be silenced." She let that settle for a moment before delivering the final cut. "So if you think my presence here is somehow problematic for you, I suggest you get used to it. Because I'm not going anywhere. The applause started slowly, just as before. One or two pairs of hands clapping in the room's center. But this time it grew faster, louder, spreading from table to table until the sound filled every corner of the ballroom. Some guests stood. Others simply clapped from their seats. But the approval was unmistakable. Ivanka's reaction remained carefully controlled. She didn't roll her eyes or smirk. She offered a small, polite smile, the kind that could be interpreted as either graciousness or calculated composure. She raised her glass slightly, as if acknowledging the applause, though everyone knew it wasn't meant for her. Several guests exchanged glances, some impressed by Crockett's composure, others clearly unsettled that this confrontation had occurred at all in such a controlled environment. The Liberty Foundation dinner was supposed to be about behind-closed-doors influence, not viral moments. Yet here they were, witnessing one being born. Across the room, Grace Whitmore, the journalist who'd been nursing bourbon earlier, had her phone angled low but steady, recording the entire exchange. She knew instinctively that what she'd captured could lead the evening news. And if handled correctly, it would. The room's energy didn't fully return to normal after that. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more fragmented. People who had been relaxed over steak and wine now seemed to be calculating what their presence in this moment might mean if clips began circulating. Ivanka remained at her table, smiling politely at whoever addressed her. But her attention kept drifting toward guests who were still watching from a distance. Crockett, meanwhile, returned to her seat, accepting quiet handshakes and brief words of praise from those nearby. No one said it aloud, but everyone in that room understood what had just transpired. A high-profile figure had said something that could not be unsaid, and her target had responded in a way that elevated her own standing rather than diminishing it. But Crockett's answer wasn't just about this singular moment. It was the kind of response that would resonate far beyond the Mayflower Hotel's walls once the footage reached the public. What made Crockett's response so devastating wasn't just the words. It was her delivery. There was no tremor in her voice, no flash of visible anger, no elevated tone. She spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had anticipated this moment her entire career and was finally ready to deliver the lesson she'd been preparing to teach. To match the sting of Ivanka's remark, she remained composed, deliberate, even conversational. That control was its own statement. People in politics understand that public perception hinges as much on body language as on sound bites. A flare of temper, a slip in tone, these can overshadow the message entirely. Crockett knew this, and she wielded that knowledge like a surgeon's scalpel. She didn't just address Ivanka. She spoke to the entire room, to the servers gliding silently between tables, the lobbyists leaning back in their chairs, the donors who'd been casually sipping wine moments before. And perhaps most importantly, she spoke to the cameras in people's pockets, knowing her real audience would be watching later from couches, subway cars, and office desks across the country. "My great-grandfather," she said, "wore the uniform of the United States Army in World War II. He fought in Europe at a time when he couldn't sit at a lunch counter back home without being told to leave. My grandmother picked cotton in Texas as a girl and still managed to put herself through nursing school. My father served as a firefighter for 30 years. So don't you tell me, or anyone like me, that we don't belong here. We've earned this place 10 times over." There was a pause, a heavy one, before she continued. "Your family's American story began just a few decades ago. Mine began before this country even recognized people who looked like me as citizens. And yet here we are. I am not a guest in this country. I am part of its foundation." Her voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath it. Several guests shifted forward in their seats, drawn in by the rhythm of her words. A few leaned over their tables to catch every sentence. Crockett took another slow breath and let her eyes scan the room. The thing about telling someone to go back is that it's meant to make them feel small. It's meant to remind them of a place you think they should stay in, some imaginary boundary you believe they shouldn't cross. But here's the truth. That boundary exists only in your mind. And the people you want to keep inside it are the same people who've been tearing it down for generations. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not noisy enough to disrupt her, but noticeable. She pressed on. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about the danger of thinking that citizenship or belonging is something you get to grant or take away. The United States belongs to every one of its citizens equally. Whether their family came here on a boat in 1902, across a border in 1975, or in chains in 1619. No exceptions. The applause came again, stronger this time. As it grew, Crockett didn't raise her chin in triumph or flash a victorious smile. She simply gave a small nod of acknowledgement to those clapping, then returned her attention to Ivanka. Now, I could choose to be angry about what you just said, she added. But anger would give it more power than it deserves. Instead, I'll do what I always do. Turn it into fuel. Because comments like yours, they're the reason I ran for office. They're the reason I fight for voting rights, education access, and fair representation. And as long as I'm in this position, I'm going to keep fighting. That's my promise, not just to you, but to everyone watching this right now. The words, everyone watching this right now, landed like a quiet warning. People in the room understood what she meant. This exchange wasn't going to stay here. It was already halfway out the door in the form of texts, tweets, and video clips. Ivanka's expression didn't crack, but her stillness was telling. She glanced down at her champagne, then back up. Well, I see you feel strongly about this. Crockett didn't miss a beat. I feel strongly about justice. There it was, the pivot. She had taken the remark and reframed it, making it about a universal value rather than just a personal insult. It was the kind of rhetorical turn that politicians spend years learning to master. At one table, a man in a gray suit whispered to his wife. She just owned that moment completely. His wife nodded slightly, still watching Crockett as if she'd just witnessed a live debate performance. The moment hung for a beat longer before Crockett stepped back, ending the direct exchange. She returned to her table, but the energy in the room didn't follow her. It stayed buzzing in the air, hanging over the white tablecloths and half-eaten desserts. The fundraiser continued. Speeches were made, donations pledged. But every conversation seemed to loop back to that moment. People recounted it to their tablemates, already altering details, already shaping it into the version they would tell later. But it wasn't just the people in that room who were about to dissect what had happened. The recordings were on their way to the outside world, and the reaction would be nothing short of explosive. Even as the fundraiser tried to roll on, it was obvious the evening's rhythm had been permanently disrupted. The string quartet in the corner kept playing their soft harmonies, meant to smooth over the tension, but the crowd wasn't hearing the music anymore. They were hearing Crockett's words replaying in their heads. A few guests tried to carry on with polite conversation, but the tone had shifted. Where there had been easy smiles earlier, now there were glances over shoulders, quick side eyes toward the room's center, and whispered exchanges no one wanted overheard. At one table near the back, a lobbyist named Gregory Pike leaned toward a state senator from Nevada. That, he murmured, was a masterclass. Calm, factual, lethal. The senator gave a short, thoughtful hum of agreement before turning her gaze back toward Crockett's table. Over by the dessert buffet, two younger congressional aides who had been working the room for contacts huddled together, phones out, comparing clips they'd just captured. One of them, Marissa, sharp and quick-talking, shook her head. She didn't even blink. You can't teach that kind of composure. Across the room, the journalists in attendance were doing their own quick calculations. Grace Whitmore had already sent her editor a 30-second video file, knowing it would get flagged by the newsroom as breaking content. A political columnist for a major online outlet was scribbling in his notebook, the kind of shorthand only he could read, already shaping his lead in his mind. For the donors, the real power players in the room, the moment wasn't just about political theater. It was about alignment. Publicly siding with Crockett could curry favor with progressive causes. Staying silent could keep them in good standing with Trump allies. Choosing wrong could cost millions in influence. So they sat, watched, and weighed every angle like it was a chessboard. But the non-verbal reactions were impossible to hide. One donor, a tall man with a shock of white hair, kept his gaze fixed firmly on his plate, stabbing at a half-eaten slice of cheesecake as though avoiding eye contact could make the incident disappear. Another, a woman in a deep green dress, allowed herself the faintest smile when Crockett's words were mentioned at her table. Meanwhile, Crockett herself sat at her table as if nothing had happened. She accepted a glass of water from a server, thanked him quietly, and then leaned in to speak with the colleague seated to her left. The conversation seemed light, almost casual, but every so often her eyes swept the room, clocking who was watching and who was avoiding her gaze. Ivanka's table was a study in controlled poise. She kept her shoulders straight, her smile polite, her voice measured as she spoke with those beside her. But anyone watching closely could see the small giveaways, the quick tightening of her grip on her glass stem, the fraction of a second pause before answering someone's question. It wasn't panic, but it wasn't comfort either. One of her closest allies at the table, a well-known donor from Florida, leaned in and whispered something. Ivanka's lips curved into a faint smile at whatever was said, but her eyes didn't quite match the expression. Phones continued to record, though now it was more discreet. Aides were texting their bosses. Journalists were typing out notes. Somewhere in that ballroom, the first few tweets about what just happened were already being drafted. The quiet drama of the moment was that everyone knew the incident had legs. By tomorrow, it would be the subject of op-eds, panel discussions, and cable news segments. And depending on how each clip was edited, it could paint either woman in dramatically different lights. But the truth was, Crockett's composure had made her almost impossible to attack without looking petty. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't used personal insults. She'd stuck to history, principle, and patriotism. Even her detractors would have to admit, privately at least, that she'd handled herself flawlessly. One long-time political strategist at the far end of the room summed it up quietly to his dinner partner. That's how you turn an attack into a platform. She just made herself the headline. The senator from Nevada, still watching Crockett from across the room, took a sip of her wine and replied, and Ivanka handed it to her gift wrapped. As the evening wound down, people began making their rounds to say polite goodbyes, but the social choreography felt different. Some guests approached Crockett to shake her hand, thanking her for what she'd said. Others avoided her entirely, heading straight for the exit without another glance. Ivanka, for her part, received her own quiet line of well-wishers, though their smiles felt more like damage control than genuine warmth. The final speaker took the stage, thanked everyone for their generosity, and made the standard closing remarks about continuing the fight for shared values. But by then, everyone knew the real story of the night had already happened, and it wasn't about the dinner's cause or its fundraising total. The story was about to grow far beyond these walls, because the first videos were already hitting social media before the last guests even stepped outside. By the time the last black sedan pulled away from the Mayflower Hotel's valet line, the first clips were already ricocheting across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The very first video to hit the internet was grainy, but clear enough. Ivanka's voice unmistakable delivering the line, "Go back to Africa," followed by Crockett's calm, deliberate rebuttal. The clip was only 40 seconds long, but it was the spark that lit the fire. Within minutes, a second angle surfaced. This one, taken from a different table, showed more of the room's reaction. The shocked glances, the frozen expressions, the quick flashes of camera lights as people tried to capture the moment without drawing attention. By the time midnight rolled around, Jasmine Crockett was trending nationwide. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Crockett claps back. Hashtag go back where. Hashtag Liberty dinner leak. Cable news caught wind fast. On MSNBC, the late-night anchor interrupted a scheduled segment on international trade to roll the footage, calling it one of the most striking exchanges we've seen between a sitting member of Congress and a member of the Trump family in recent memory. CNN's political panel queued up both clips side by side, breaking down body language, tone, and intent like it was a slow-motion sports replay. Fox News took a different angle. They led with a headline, out-of-context clip sparks online frenzy. What really happened at the Liberty Foundation dinner? And spent the next 10 minutes framing it as a politically motivated attack on Ivanka Trump. But the mainstream coverage was only part of the story. On TikTok, creators were already adding captions, reaction videos, and side-by-side comparisons of Crockett's remarks with her past speeches on voting rights. Some edits layered in dramatic music, turning the moment into a mini political epic. Others use humor, looping Ivanka's comment over and over, followed by clips of people saying, "Try again," or "Wrong answer." The impact on Crockett's public profile was immediate. Her follower count on Twitter jumped by 50,000 in a matter of hours. On Instagram, screenshots of her quotes were racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Her staff's inbox was flooded with requests for interviews from The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and late-night talk shows. Inside her D.C. townhouse, Crockett's team huddled in the living room around a laptop. Malika, her communications director, was already drafting a short, measured statement. "We stick to the facts," she said, her voice decisive. "No extra punches. Just a reminder of what was said and why it matters." Crockett nodded. "I want the clip to speak for itself. If we overplay it, we look like we're milking it. If we underplay it, we miss the chance to call out what this is." Across town, Ivanka's circle was scrambling. In a conference call that stretched into the early hours, advisors debated whether to issue a denial, claim the remark was taken out of context, or stay silent and hope the storm passed. The consensus was fractured. One camp urged a quick apologetic clarification to blunt the outrage. Another insisted any acknowledgement would validate the clip. By dawn, the story had spread to every major outlet. Morning shows looped the footage, inviting legal analysts, historians, and former politicians to weigh in. Some framed Crockett as a symbol of grace under pressure. Others argued the incident was proof of deep fractures in American political discourse. In Philadelphia, a teacher played the clip for her high school civics class, sparking an impromptu debate among students about free speech, patriotism, and the responsibilities of public figures. In Phoenix, a local radio station devoted an entire hour to listener call-ins, most of them praising Crockett's composure. By the end of the day, her office had received more than 300 voicemails from constituents, most of them supportive. One caller, an elderly veteran from Ohio, left a message saying, "I fought for this country too, and I've been told the same thing you were told last night. Thank you for standing up without losing your cool." Even international outlets picked up the story. The BBC ran it under the headline, "U.S. Congresswoman responds to racist remark with viral speech." Al Jazeera featured it in their world news section, highlighting it as an example of moments when political rhetoric crosses into personal territory. Back in D.C., Crockett walked into her office the next morning to a room full of tired but energized staffers. Malika slid a stack of printed emails across the desk. "We're going to need to sort through these. A lot of invitations, a lot of, let's just say, passionate responses." Crockett skimmed the top email, then looked up. "The question now is, do we control the story, or do we let it run wild?" Malika's answer was immediate. We control it, and we start today. But the harder question, and the one that would define the next phase, was how Ivanka's camp would respond, and whether their next move would calm the storm or pour gasoline on it. By mid-morning, the Trump camp's headquarters in Palm Beach had gone into full crisis mode. The sun was barely up over the Atlantic when Ivanka's top advisors, public relations staff, and a few trusted family allies crowded into the long, glass-walled conference room on the second floor. Phones were buzzing nonstop. Laptops were open to trending dashboards, every screen showing Crockett's name climbing higher in searches. Ivanka sat at the head of the table, hair perfectly in place despite the early hour. She wasn't visibly rattled, but the tightness in her jaw gave her away to anyone who knew her well. On her left, her communications director, Brent Farlow, clicked through a series of slides showing social media metrics, news coverage, and polling snapshots. "Here's the reality," Brent said, pointing to a chart that looked like a sharp, sudden mountain peak. Overnight, Crockett's favorability numbers spiked by 9 points among independents. 9 points. That's unheard of for an incident less than 12 hours old. "And our numbers?" Ivanka asked. Brent hesitated. "They're flat among core supporters. But among swing voters, there's a drop, 2 points so far, and trending downward." Ivanka's chief of staff, a crisp-spoken woman named Lauren Chizek, leaned forward. "We have 2 options. 1. Issue a statement saying the remark was taken out of context. Stress that you were speaking about political philosophy, not race. 2. Ignore it entirely, ride out the news cycle, and hope she overplays her hand." A man at the far end of the table, Tom Severs, a longtime family strategist, shook his head. "Option 2 is risky. This isn't a fringe blog post. Every major outlet is running it. Ignoring it makes it look like we can't defend it. And if she keeps her cool in every interview, we're the ones who look reactive." Lauren countered. "Issuing a statement draws a second wave of attention. It guarantees more coverage." They went back and forth like that for 20 minutes. Finally, Ivanka raised her hand slightly, quieting the room. "If I say it was about political philosophy, will anyone believe me?" Brent's silence was the answer. "Then we pivot," Ivanka said. "We talk about unity, shared values, working together despite differences. We position it as a misunderstanding without repeating the words. And we do it in my voice, not through a press release. A sit-down interview, controlled setting, one network." Tom frowned. "And which network is going to handle that gently right now?" "I'll make a few calls," Ivanka said flatly. Meanwhile, across town, Crockett's team was taking a different approach. Malika had pulled up a list of the day's most prominent interview requests. Good Morning America, The View, NPR's All Things Considered. "We pick 3, Malika told the group. 1 national morning show, 1 evening cable spot, 1 radio or podcast. We don't saturate. We make every appearance count." Crockett agreed. "I don't want to sound like I'm just milking it for headlines, but I do want to frame this for what it is, an example of how prejudice, even when it's dressed up in polite company, still shapes the way some people think about belonging in America." They mapped out talking points, keeping them tight and repeatable. No long policy lectures, no tangents. Every answer would circle back to history, shared values, and why representation matters. While Crockett was preparing to speak publicly, Ivanka's team was busy trying to close ranks. Allies were contacted and asked, some more forcefully than others, to put out tweets about respecting different viewpoints and staying focused on issues that unite us. A few complied, posting vague statements that skirted the incident entirely. Others declined, wary of being dragged into the firestorm. One of Ivanka's more media-savvy friends floated the idea of releasing a photo from the dinner of the 2 women smiling in conversation, framing it as evidence that the exchange had been respectful disagreement. But when the PR team reached out to a photographer who'd been working the event, he admitted that no such photo existed. Every image from the night showed the two women either speaking intently or standing apart. By the end of the day, Ivanka had secured a spot on a prime-time cable interview with a sympathetic host. The plan was to focus on her philanthropic work, slip in a few comments about misunderstandings in the age of social media, and avoid repeating the remark verbatim. The hope was to soften the blow without reigniting the outrage. But the timing was working against her. Crockett's Good Morning America appearance was scheduled for the next morning, hours before Ivanka's interview would air. That meant Crockett's framing of the event would likely be the one most Americans heard first. And in politics, first impressions are hard to rewrite. But Crockett's real advantage wasn't just the order of the interviews. It was the way her story resonated beyond politics, turning her into something bigger than a single moment in a ballroom. By the time Jasmine Crockett sat down in the Good Morning America studio the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The producers didn't need to hype the segment. Viewers were tuning in specifically to hear her speak. Cameras rolled, the host welcomed her, and Crockett wasted no time. "I'm not here to relitigate a single comment," she began. "I'm here to talk about what that comment represents and why it still happens in 2025. Her voice was steady, warm even, but every sentence carried weight. She talked about the long history of Black Americans who had been told, in ways big and small, that they didn't belong. She reminded viewers that her own family's sacrifices, military service, community leadership, public safety, were part of the very fabric of the country. And she framed the remark not as an isolated insult, but as a reminder that prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in a whisper, or in a perfectly appointed ballroom over champagne. The host asked if she believed Ivanka's words were intentional. Crockett didn't take the bait. "I can't speak to what's in someone else's heart," she said. "But I can speak to the impact. And the impact is this. Comments like that signal to millions of people that their Americanness is conditional. That's not acceptable, no matter who says it, no matter where they say it." Social media lit up within minutes. People praised her refusal to be drawn into personal attacks, her focus on the bigger picture. Clips from the interview circulated alongside footage from the dinner, reinforcing the contrast. A poised congresswoman against the backdrop of an unguarded remark. In living rooms across the country, the moment sparked conversations that weren't about party lines or specific policies, but about belonging, identity, and respect. Some people shared personal stories of being told they should go back somewhere, despite having lived in the United States their whole lives. Others admitted they'd never realized how common such experiences were until they saw Crockett's response. That afternoon, Crockett's office released a short video message on her social channels. Standing in front of a plain backdrop, she spoke directly to the camera. "If you've ever been told you don't belong here, I want you to hear me clearly. You do. Your contributions matter. Your voice matters. And no one gets to take that from you. Not with a comment, not with a policy, not with anything." The video went viral, not just political viral, but genuinely viral. Shared by athletes, musicians, teachers, community leaders. For once, the internet's attention wasn't on tearing someone down, but on amplifying a message of inclusion. Meanwhile, Ivanka's carefully planned prime-time interview aired that evening. The lighting was flattering, the questions gentle. She spoke about her philanthropic work, emphasized miscommunications in a fast-moving media landscape, and pivoted to topics like job training and women's entrepreneurship. But it was clear the public had already chosen the narrative they believed. And it wasn't hers. In the days that followed, Crockett's profile rose even higher. She was invited to keynote a leadership conference in Boston, deliver the commencement address at a college in California, and appear on a Sunday political panel that had previously been dominated by more established figures. Her campaign donations spiked, not just from her district, but from across the country. But for Crockett, the most meaningful responses came from ordinary people. A handwritten letter from a retired nurse in Oklahoma, a drawing from a middle school student in Oregon showing Crockett speaking at a podium, a voicemail from a man in Alabama thanking her for showing my granddaughter what strength looks like. When asked later how she'd kept her composure in that ballroom, Crockett said, "It wasn't about me. If I'd made it about me, I would have just been angry. But I was thinking about every person who's been in that position before. Hearing those words, feeling that sting. I wanted them to see that you can answer without lowering yourself." And that was the real moral of the moment. Strength isn't just about volume. It's about control. Dignity under pressure can speak louder than outrage. And sometimes the best way to counter an insult is to turn it into a mirror. One that reflects the truth back so clearly that no one can look away. As Crockett closed out her Boston keynote a month later, she left the audience with a challenge. If you're in the room when someone draws a line meant to exclude you, you have two choices. You can step back and let it stand, or you can stand on it and make it your platform. I know which one I'll choose every single time. That applause wasn't just polite. It was sustained deep and filled with the kind of energy that meant people were leaving the room ready to carry the message forward. So if you're watching this and you've ever been in a position where someone tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, remember, your response can rewrite the moment. Your words can travel further than their insult ever will. And your dignity, once shown, can't be taken back. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more real conversations about power, respect, and standing your ground. Because these moments matter, and so does how we meet them.